morning, everyone, and welcome to our final day and sessions of Aiwac 2024. The first session is on mourning and memory, and our first speaker is Jonathan Sasso. Scusami. Jonathan obtained his master's degree in modern history from the University of Pisa and in art history from the Scuola Normale Superiore, with a thesis on Eleonora di Toledo, and he now works in the private sector. He continued to pursue his research with keen interest as an independent scholar. His publications in recent years, both completed and forthcoming, particularly focus on the self-fashioning of royal women between the late Middle Ages and the early modern period, such as Valentina Visconti, Duchess of Orleans, Eleonora di Toledo, Duchess of Florence, and Vittoria della Rovere, Grand Duchess of Tuscany, studying how these women staged their own conditioned values and ideas, and so affirmed their own vision of female royalty. And Jonathan this morning will be presenting us with a talk titled Staging the Royal Mourning, the Self-Fashioning of Louise of Lorraine, Dowager Queen of France. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Adelina. And I join the other speakers in thanking Consuelo and Adelina for giving all of us the opportunity to be here. So, Louise of Lorraine, wife of Henri III of France, was the last consort queen of the Valois dynasty from 1575 to 1589, the year of her husband's assassination. Reserved, pious, childless, she's not among the most renowned queens of France. However, her story becomes particularly intriguing in the moment she was destined to exit the public stage following Henri III's death. Retreating to the Château de Chenonceau, she transformed her life into a living tribute to her husband's memory, embodying the ideal model of a widow in the eyes of her contemporaries. Her apartments, characterized by a striking iconography centered on themes of grief and widowhood, served as the finest example of a mourning room, leaving a profound impression on visitors to the chateau in the years that followed. In this presentation, I will analyze the iconography of these rooms, identify their possible sources, and clarify their history. On August 1st, 1589, Henri III was stabbed by the Jacobin friar Jacques Clément at Saint-Cloud, dying the next day. The king managed to write a last message to Louise. Mamie, j'espère que je me porterai très bien. Priez Dieu pour moi et ne bougez de là. My dear, I hope I will be very well. Pray God for me and do not move from there. Louise, who was at the Château de Chenonceau, took her husband's last wishes to heart. Unfortunately, we don't have any painted portraits of Louise from this period. We only have an engraving that depicts her in the black mourning attire already worn by Catherine de' Medici, her mother-in-law. However, we know that Louise chose the more traditional white mourning of the French queens, earning her the historical nickname of Reine Blanche, la Reine Blanche, the White Queen. Until the end of her days, the greatest concern of the Dowager Queen was the rehabilitation of her husband's memory. The most spectacular way Louise celebrated her husband's legacy was undoubtedly through the decoration of her apartments in the chateau. She chose to occupy the rooms built by Catherine de' Medici on a terrace connecting the chapel to the library. They remained largely intact until 17 1834, when Madame Dupin, the new owner of the chateau, decided to remove these somber decorations and had the ceiling repainted for use as woodwork in another room, the Green Cabinet. Furthermore, during restoration work on the chateau in 1866, it was decided to completely demolish this room in order to restore the original terrace. A surviving panel from Louise's oratory was installed in the center of the ceiling of the gallery on the ground floor. A few years later, the woodwork repainted by Madame Dupin was restored and placed in another room of the chateau, the so-called now Room of the Five Queens. The background was changed from color black to red. By the late 1990s, it was finally decided to recreate Louise's bedroom in a room on the third floor of the chateau. The woodwork that has previously been installed in the gallery was placed on the ceiling, while modern panels were added to the walls, partially replicating the decor of the ceiling in the Room of the Five Queens. One scholar, Anna Klosowska, in an article about the Chantepleurs, the widow's emblem of Valentina Visconti, Duchess of Orléans, claims that in Louise's chamber we find as well a chantepleur. I will tell you shortly what this special object is, accompanied by the letter S and the Latin motto solam sepe se ipsam sollicitari suspirareque. However, none of this information is correct. There are no chantepleurs in Louise's room, and especially no inscription. Valentina Visconti, who died in 1408, is a key figure for the later Valois. Along with her husband, Louis of Orléans, she was the founder of the cadet branch of the Valois that came to power after the death of Charles VIII. Valentina was the great-grandmother of Henry III, and her tragic story was still well known during Louise's time. After the assassination of Louis of Orléans, she, like Louise, sought justice in vain and lived in the memory of her deceased husbands, displaying publicly her grief and dying just a year later, her husband, of a broken heart, according to her contemporaries. Claude Paradin, the author of an important collection of emblems, published an engraving in 1557 depicting Valentina's mourning emblem, which could still be seen at that time in the now lost Church of the Cordeliers in Blois. This emblem featured a chantepleur entwined with a scroll and the motto Rien ne me plus, plus ne me rien, which can be translated as nothing matters to me anymore. The chantepleur was topped with the letter S, indicating, according to Paradin, that the Duchess seule souvent se souciait et soupirait. She often lamented and sighed alone. This phrase, but translated into Latin, is the same one that Anna Klosowska claims is present in Louise's chamber. It is uncertain whether the decoration of the Church of Blois were still well preserved in Louise's time, as the Huguenots burned the church in 1568. However, a French dictionary from 1743 indicates that the Château de Châteauneuf-sur-Loire, Valentina Visconti's summer residence, chantepleurs could still be seen everywhere. It is therefore possible that Louise had seen this type of decor and drew inspiration for her own apartments. Nevertheless, we can say with certainty that Louise's emblems are not chantepleurs. What is a chantepleur? It is a terracotta watering can in the shape of a bottle with many holes punched in its base. Blocking the top hole with one's thumb controls the flow of water. However, in the decor of Louise's chamber, we see something different, which visitors in the 17th century simply referred in French as cornets, small horns. In my view, these are inverted cornucopias, suggesting a negative connotation. No longer filled with fruits and riches, they are empty and overturned, weeping tears of sorrow. In the reconstruction of the 1990s, the cornucopias are not accompanied by an inscriptions. However, the originals did feature a motto, as noted by Abbot Casimir Chevalier, who documented the restoration undertaken on the chateau in the mid-19th century. On the frames separating the triangular compartments with the cornucopias, there are, barely visible still nowadays, some painted branches of myrtle symbolizing love, which were accompanied by the sentence Nostra sed in tumulo, which can be translated as these symbols of love belong to us even in the grave. What else we can say about the original appearance of Louise of Lorraine's apartments? Here you can see a plan of the chateau just before the restoration work of 1866. For convenience, I will use a modern plan, which I have modified based on the ancient one. Louise's apartment consists of 5 rooms. 2 of these, now lost, were located on the terrace. The larger one was the bedroom, while the smaller one served as an oratory situated adjacent to the chateau's chapel. Bedroom, oratory, and chapel. The other 3 rooms, which still exist today, are the antechamber, now known as the Room of Diana of Poitiers, the so-called green cabinets, and named for the tapestry and upholstery chosen by Catherine de' Medici, and the library. As previously mentioned, the decoration of the bedroom were dismantled in 1734. However, by examining the inventory of Louise's possession compiled 2 years after her death in 1603, along with a meticulous description of the chateau made in 1659 by Sieur Dubuisson, and another one written in 1681 by André Philibien, we can gain a precise idea of their appearance. It's also useful to compare these with the description provided by Abbot Casimir Chevalier in 1864, just before the restoration work on the chateau began. Regarding the first room, the antechamber, we have very little specific information. Next, we found the green cabinets. Louise decided to keep the tapestry and furniture in that color, only adding black and silver fringes. Above the fireplace, she put a full-length portrait of her husband and an inscription from Virgil's Aeneid placed on the mantle that read, Sevi monumenta doloris, the memory of an immeasurable pain. This inscription was still legible in 1864, although the portrait above it had already been lost. The small library contained just over 100 books inside the chest, 5 portraits, the identities of which are unspecified, 2 crucifixes, 2 religious paintings, Mary and Mary Magdalene, and several mirrors. Accessing the Queen's room, one would notice a completely black wooden ceiling adorned with tears flowing from the little horns. This is the same ceiling we discussed earlier, which is now located in the room of the 5 queens. Above the fireplace hung a portrait depicting Catherine de' Medici between her III and Louise, accompanied by another of Virgil's quotes, Vivite felices, quibus est fortuna peracta. Be happy, your fortune is achieved. In the same room, there were 3 additional portraits, that of the Duke of Mercoeur, Louise's brother, and those of his son and daughter. The walls were black and decorated with various grim images, including bones, skulls, and shovels, which made an impression on the famous cousin of Louis XIV, La Grande Mademoiselle, who visited the chateau when she was just 10 years old in 1637. All the fabrics adorning the bed and furniture were equally black and silver. The oratory connecting the bedroom to the chateau's chapel featured the same type of ceiling with cornucopias and tiers. It contains 2 crucifixes, 11 paintings, both large and small, and 11 works Agnus Dei. The walls were draped with black velvet curtains trimmed in silver, also decorated with grim imagery, still visible in 1864. Additionally, there was a large panel decorating one of the walls, depicting the monogram of Louise and her husband, an intertwined H with 2 lambdas, along with emblems, a cord symbolizing widowhood and feathers inserted into a crown of thorns. Abbot Chevalier interpreted the emblem with the feathers as a symbol of Louise's suffering, noting that in French, pen, feathers, and pen, sorrows are pronounced the same way. I would add that this represents the evolution of Louise's first known emblem, used on a token from 1576, accompanied by the motto Amor equat amantes, love equalizes lovers. The 2 feathers were tied together with a branch of myrtle, symbol of love, and a love note. Is the case of Louise of Lorraine unique? No. Her room fits into a centuries-old tradition that strictly codified female mourning in the royal and aristocratic wards. Depending on the degrees of kinship with the deceased and their rank, a woman was required to remain secluded for a certain number of days or weeks in a room entirely draped in black curtains, where she would receive visitors. For a queen, due to her status, the period of seclusion following the death of the king was 1 year. So Louise had many illustrious predecessors behind her, some of whom were directly linked to the royal family. We have seen the case of Valentina Visconti, but the most obvious and immediate example is that of Catherine de' Medici, who similarly celebrated the memory of Henry II with great intensity. The existence of mourning rooms has been documented since the early 14th century. During the 16th century, an evolution occurred, no longer just black curtains and drapes, but painted decorations on the walls, as seen in Louise's case. In addition to her room, 2 others have survived. One is located at the Château de Châteaudun, also in the Loire region, likely created in 1573, following the death of Léonard d'Orléans Longueville. The other is at the Château d'Ancy-le-Franc in Burgundy, probably established in 1615 for the death of Catherine Marie d'Escoubleau, whose monograms can be found on the ceiling. The latter in particular bears some resemblance to Louise's room, as it features the emblem of feathers. The origin of these 2 rooms are unclear, but they have been linked to the deaths and funerals of the 2 individuals, suggesting they were likely mortuary chambers where the deceased's body was displayed, so something a bit different from Louise's chamber. Interestingly, the small oratory in the second chateau, adjacent to the chapel, also features decor with bones and skulls, as Louise's one. The widow's seclusions in her mourning room was not a private manifestation, but a public one, playing a significant role in the self-fashioning strategies of women in the society. Louise of Lorraine's case differs from that of her contemporaries due to the intensity with which she publicly embodied a role as the ideal widow whose mourning lasts not just 1 year, but a full lifetime. After Louise's death, the Franciscan friar Nicolas Gazet published a book titled Le Miroir de Veuve ou la vie et la mort de Louise de Lorraine. And a year later, during the funeral of her brother, the Duke of Mercoeur, the oration delivered by Saint Francois de Sales once again referred to the Dowager Queen as the mirror of piety and the very ideal of princesses of our time. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for a very fascinating paper on queenship and mourning. Our second speaker is Patricia Rocco, who is speaking to us from remote. Is Patricia?
Am I there? Yay!
Good morning. Is it morning?
Okay, good morning.
Yes.
Everything working?
Looks like it, yes.
Okay, great.
Yes, yes.
Yay, okay.
And I'll introduce Patricia.
Thank you.
Patricia Rocco received her PhD from the Graduate Centre CUNY and is an adjunct professor of art history at Hunter College, Manhattan School of Music and Cooper Union. She has published articles on women artists, gender and material culture, especially women's work with textiles. Her book, The Devout Hand, Women, Virtue and Visual Culture in Early Modern Italy, has recently been published by McGill Queen's University Press. Rocco has also published 2 chapters on popular prints and games in the early modern world, Virtuous Vices, Giuseppe Maria Mitelli's Gambling Prints, and the social mapping of leisure and gender in post-Tridentine Bologna, in Playthings in Early Modernity, Party Games, Word Games, Mind Games, and also the essay, The World Upside Down, Giuseppe Maria Mitelli's Games and the Performance of Identity in the Early Modern World in Games and Game Playing in Early Modern Art and Literature. Patricia will be talking to us this morning on Women, Desire and Death, the disappearance of Beatrice Cenci. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's so great to be here. And thanks so much also to both of you, Adelina and Consuelo, for all the work you've been putting into this fantastic conference. Okay. So what is it about this image itself that has fed the public's ongoing fascination with the tragic story of this wronged young woman across time? Complex mysteries still surround the identification of an image, now famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, as the gaze of the doomed romantic anti-heroine. It was perhaps inevitable that the romantic poets such as Shelley would have become so enthralled with this story. However, the fascination began even earlier as it spread from both visual to literary media. The well-known story, in brief, is that Beatrice Cenci, locked away and denied a natural marriage, abused by her own father, eventually took justice into her own hands and killed her father with the help of her brother and mother-in-law. After being imprisoned, Cenci was executed in front of Castel Sant'Angelo on September 11, 1599, by beheading, the punishment at the time for patricide. Pope Clement VIII was the unyielding pope who meted out the verdict and refused any calls for clemency. In examining the image, its history and provenance, we're often met with 2 questions. One, who is the painter, whether Guido Reni, as long held, or Elisabetta Sirani, or more recently, Ginevra Cantofoli, and there are other suggestions as well. And two, whether or not it is actually Beatrice as opposed to simply a Sibyl. But these aspects of the painting are of less interest to me than the reception of the painting itself as Cenci and the enchantment that it casts upon the viewer across the centuries. The power of Beatrice's portrait lay perhaps in her gaze, those luminous eyes as they regard the viewer looking back over her shoulder with a melancholy stare that seems to bore into the very soul of all who look upon her. That gaze is a concentration of pain and sadness. The gesture itself of turning back inevitably implies a loss, a glance back to a long gone past which will not and cannot ever return, a longing for justice, perhaps, an expression which fueled a never-ending list of authors, playwrights, and filmmakers from the 17th century until today, and there seems to be no end in sight. From Shelley, Stendhal, Dumas, and Dickens to Hawthorne, Melville, and Moravia, and countless others, including the work of Corrado Ricci, who attempted to bring her down to earth a bit, and to Marco Besso's library and the wonderful exhibition in 1999, which commemorated 400 years after her death, as well as great scholars such as Alessandro Massou, who transcribed the trial records with the purpose of letting the real Beatrice speak, neither saint nor femme fatale. In that glance, the tragedy of her family story continues to echo throughout time against the backdrop of the patriarchal system of the church and government in Rome at the end of the 16th century. It is true that at various moments of her story, it was thought that the painting might just be a Sibyl, one of those women from antiquity gifted with prophecy. However, we cannot deny that it has come one way or another to represent the mistreated Cenci and to represent her so powerfully in the collective psyche for centuries that there seems to be little cause to discuss her as anything else. Even Charles Dickens was haunted by the painting when he saw it in Rome in 1845, stating that it was, quote, almost impossible to be forgotten, since her eyes expressed celestial hope and a beautiful sorrow and a desolate earthly helplessness, end quote. So it is that perception of the image that we are concerned with today. In the end, perhaps this visual memory and imprint is her final revenge. She will not go quietly into the night as her image continues to haunt us, a constant reminder of her injustice suffered at the hands of family, church, and state, an echo of any current unpunished violence and injustices done to women today. What I have found to be of interest is the actual placement and display of the painting in the famous galleries of Rome by its collectors and its receptions by audience throughout time. Today, the painting sits in the Barberini collection in a room with Caravaggio's violent painting of Judith and Holofernes, a bloody decapitation reminiscent of Beatrice's own, and probably inspired by such, as it is highly probable that Caravaggio witnessed Cenci's beheading. The fact that they're both in the same room now has become a constant reminder of the execution, but also a new message, one where Beatrice can be author, not victim, metaphorically transformed into Judith, a type of virtual revenge via Caravaggio's brush, Judith's blade, and her own nearby portrait. In addition to this painting, the same room holds various versions of The Fallen Woman, from Guido Reni's ultra-saintly image on the left of the Magdalene to Cagnacci's sadomasochistic erotic version, the fetishizing of a woman's vulnerability, visually linking her suffering with sexual ecstasy for a heterosexual audience. Artemisia Gentileschi's self-portrait at the easel is also in the same room, another female victim of sexual violence, completing the link between violence women and women artists in the room. However, this hanging was certainly not the original arrangement. We shall see that somehow her painting went from being part of a collection of exotic, beautiful, and mysterious, self-assured women, earthly seductresses, instead to now the biblical woman representing the patriarchal polarities of woman, virgin, or biblical revenge machine. What effect might the original arrangement have had on the viewer? The painting was seen by Stendhal in the Barberini collection in 1823, but when Shelley saw it, it was still in the Colonna collection in 1819. The attribution of the portrait to a famous artist, as well as the identification and suggestion of the subject, are details that might have been constructed by the great noble families of Rome, according to Pliny, as they had a stake in creating ties between themselves. It was, after all, Anna Colonna who befriended Caravaggio and helped him escape to safety when he committed murder in Rome. All press is good press for the aristocrats, perhaps. If we return now to the Barberini collection, Stendhal sets the scene for us in his retelling of the Cenci story and describes the painting as he saw it there in 1832. He mentions that all the tourists came to Rome to see the portraits of certain beautiful ladies there, himself included. These images became a synecdoche for the beauty of the city, to be anatomized and consumed by the viewer. Therefore, the author's journey began with a deliberate desire to see the painting, stemming mostly from oral history. Apparently, she was placed among the images of 3 other strong, beautiful, and self-possessed women. Stendhal mentions a portrait of the mistress of Raphael, clearly identifying her role as such, La Fornerina. He presents the second painting, actually the wife of Sultan Suleiman, Roxelana, or the Sultana Rosa, she's also called, and describes her as a Greek slave, and names her also as a mistress, in this case, the mistress of the Doge. Stendhal then names the stepmother of Cenci as the third painting, Lucrezia Petroni, and then proceeds to describe the portrait of Beatrice in romantic terms. Stendhal writes, quote, "The face is sweet and beautiful, gentle, the eyes very large. They seem to be the eyes of a person who has just been surprised in the act of weeping hot tears." Shelley, on the other hand, tells us that a manuscript was communicated to him, a copy of the original records kept in the Cenci Palace archives, and it was the manuscript that led him to write the tale for posterity. He also mentions that when he arrived in Rome in 1819, he couldn't mention the name of Cenci without it arousing immense interest. Since he had a copy of Guido's painting with him, he went to the Colonna Palace with a servant who instantly recognized the painting. The poet writes that it aroused in him a great, quote, romantic pity, end quote. He also describes it as, quote, a just representation of one of the loveliest specimens in nature. In the whole mien, there is a simplicity and dignity which united with her, because that loveliness and deep sorrow is inexpressibly pathetic, end quote. So we can compare this to, say, Michelangelo's virile Sibyl from the Sistine ceiling, of whom no one would write the same things that Shelley wrote, with her muscular features and masculine power, a completely different type of Sibyl. Other examples of Sibyls by Reni, closer in spirit to Beatrice, for example, contain turbans of a fabric that is clearly Middle Eastern in design, though, meant to evoke an authentic sense of ancient biblical lands. Across the Atlantic, Beatrice's melancholy gaze continued to stir emotions and inspire the sensitive soul. In 1882, the American writer Melville wrote that it was more the picture that established the legend rather than the text. Meanwhile, the 19th century certainly produced a flood of images, such as the one by Achille Leonardi here, not to mention countless engravings and prints by other artists. There is even a version of Beatrice in sculpture by an American artist, Harriet Hosmer from Philadelphia, in which she echoes some of the pathos of those other romantic figures. The story of Cenci must have captured some of the angst of the female sculptor's own repressive situation with her controlling father. Another American writer, Hawthorne, mused on this story for inspiration in a separate short fiction he wrote, The Marble Faun. However, he was unhappy in Rome, put off by the remnants of a pagan culture that he so detested, based on his strict Calvinist upbringing. It is all the more shocking, then, that he was completely taken by the image of Shenchi, for whom he felt some compassion and empathy based on the pity she provoked. To this group of artists, we could also add the British photographer Julia Margaret Cameron and her photo, posed, of course, of a contemplative, highly suggestive, and melancholy headshot of Beatrice in black and white. At this point, then, the image brings forth a discussion of the idea of memory and disappearance, as we are nothing more than simply organic forms or inanimate objects without it. Alexandre Dumas mentioned that both Cenci and her stepmother wanted to be interred in particular churches. Cenci had requested to be interred in the church of San Pietro in Montorio, at a site under the altar where Raphael's Transfiguration hung. And yet there isn't a stitch of commemorative writing in evidence there where she was buried. Instead, buried there is an unbroken chain of abuse attached to the story. There is a small plaque reminding us of the prison they were both kept in before the execution, the no longer extant Corte Savella. This was put up in 1999. However, this is really more of a monument to the justice and penal system of Baroque Rome rather than to the women themselves. As a matter of fact, in a rather ironic twist of fate, the chapel itself at Montorio is touted today as the perfect wedding venue. Aime. Apparently, Cenci had, Cenci had specifically requested to be interred at San Pietro in Montorio, as it was a church she had attended as a young girl. She was indeed buried there, though in an unmarked grave, because she was a patricide. Yes, her remains were apparently located under that altar at one point, but no longer. I strongly urge a marker to be set up again near the altar where she wished to be commemorated, a necessary reminder of her final resting place, so that she can be properly memorialized as a woman who was let down by not only her family, but also by the institutions of justice that were meant to protect her from a misogynistic church to a cruel court system that enforced a habit of leniency for the infractions of noble families, but only of noble men. Women were not granted the same leniency. To add insult to injury, Vincenzo Camuccini, a late 18th century Italian painter who was restoring the painting by Raphael, tells us that her remains were desecrated by Napoleon's French soldiers who came looking for loot and desecrated the tomb. There seems to be a continued line of abuse of women here. In addition to Napoleon, another French general, Alphonse Juin, was also responsible much later in the mid-20th century for the violence perpetrated on thousands of women in Italy again during the horrible story of the Marochinate during World War II, May 16, 1944. So to conclude, in a postscript and further example of differing gender standards and the desecration of Italian art, the Transfiguration by Raphael was also taken by Napoleon's soldiers, but was eventually brought back to Italy. Why, you may ask? Because it was an incredibly important painting by a famous male artist, of course, while no one seemed to care much about poor Beatrice's mortal remains. This disappearance, this omission is a tragedy itself, a mutilation, an erasure, another death, and should be rectified with a funerary monument, a final resting place for such a damned soul, to give her a voice of her own, to tell her tragic story of female abuse to the world. Perhaps the painting, That Gaze, is her only monument to her outrage, a necessary commemoration, a revenge and reminder for society today, since, as far as women and violence are concerned, rape and femicide continue, alas, especially in war-torn areas such as the Middle East or even Italy. On all sides, women suffer, lest we forget. Let this be a call for peace, a plea for justice for Beatrice Cenci, to reappear as herself, neither sinner nor saint, in memoriam. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you. Our next speaker is Lindsay Maldari. Lindsay completed her bachelor's degree in art history and political science in 2019 at Elon University, North Carolina. She then moved to Rome to earn her master's degree in art history at John Cabot University. Lindsay graduated in 2022 upon the completion of a master's thesis on grassroots commemoration of the Fosse Andreattine massacre. Lindsay plans to pursue a PhD in art history, where she will continue her work on grassroots commemoration of the Italian resistance and the popular post-war destruction of fascist monuments and symbols. She currently remains based in Rome and now works as a program coordinator with the Borromini Institute, where she coordinates academic curricula for American universities and delivers guest lectures to visiting students. And she's also recently taken on the role of proofreader and editor for the Italian Studies academic journal Annali d'Italianistica. Welcome, Lindsay, who will be speaking on agency in mourning, the role of women as stewards of memory in post-war commemoration of the Fosse Andreattine massacre. Thank you.
Hello, okay. Thank you for the lovely introduction, and thank you all to everybody for being here today and for the organizers for bringing us all together. So my talk today inevitably begins with the events of March 23rd, 1944 on the nearby Via Rasella. It was here during Rome's 9-month Nazi occupation that resistance fighters orchestrated a bombing attack that resulted in 33 German casualties. Believing that the explosion had come from above, the German troops shot towards the windows of nearby buildings, resulting in the bullet holes we see here. Since they were unsuccessful in detaining any of the partisans involved in the attack, Nazi forces called for the retaliatory massacre of 10 Italians for each German killed. Less than 24 hours later, SS troops had executed 335 men, mainly partisans and Jews, in a set of abandoned caves now infamously known as the Fosse Ardeatine. The Mausoleo delle Fosse Ardeatine was later inaugurated at the victims' execution site in 1949. Designed according to Italy's first national architectural competition, the mausoleum is an exceedingly rare example of a state-commissioned resistance monument from the immediate post-war period. The complex primarily consists of an external mausoleum where the 335 victims' tombs are housed, which we see the interior of here, and which we now see here on the left from its exterior, as well as the empty caves where the execution occurred, which are here on the right. Since the victims came from a range of social, political, and religious backgrounds, they were soon made to symbolically represent the Italian nation as a whole, meaning that the mausoleum took on an immediate national significance. But the 335 men who lost their lives are not the only victims of this mass tragedy. A collective of hundreds of grieving mothers and widows had suddenly formed overnight as a result of the massacre as well. And as we will see today, many quickly turned to commemorative activism as a channel for their immense grief and rage. Whereas World War I commemoration was almost exclusively guided by the Italian state in the name of a unifying nationalism, commemoration and mourning following World War II saw the introduction of a wider range of actors, most notably family organizations that were largely run by the wives and mothers of lost partisans. In the case of the Fosse Ardeatine, the Associazione Nazionale fra le Famiglie Italiane dei Martiri Trucidati dai Nazifascisti, better known as ANFIM, was formed. Though initially chaired exclusively by men, oral history accounts collected by Alessandro Portelli in the 1990s, to which today's presentation is deeply indebted, point to the fact that ANFIM was foremost a community of women collectively navigating their personal grief. ANFIM's primary goal in the months and years after the massacre was to commemorate those lost and make visible the tragic events that occurred as a simultaneously moral and political act. As early as the first official meeting of Rome's post-occupation provisional government in July 1944, the cabinet swore their, quote, solemn commitment to erect on the site of the German crime a monument that as a new altare della patria will commemorate for centuries the war of Italy's second Risorgimento, end quote. In response, ANFIM insisted that the monument be commissioned according to an open call or bando di concorso, the first in post-liberation Italy. This commission format alone has played a crucial role in the monument's reception over time. Thanks to the open call, nearly every applicant to the bando was an early career architect with no prior affiliations to fascist commissions. Therefore, not only the formal characteristics of the monument, but also the ideological affiliations of its makers, was intended as a deliberate and purifying rupture from the 20 preceding years of fascist architectural hegemony. Yet, though the importance, necessity, and canonicity of the mausoleo is indisputable, the goal of the present study is instead to recognize the individual memories and resistance narratives that cannot fit within a univocal monument to a mass tragedy. This paper contends that the long-standing critical acclaim of the mausoleo as an exemplary work of Italian post-war architecture has obfuscated the protracted dissent from victim families throughout the monument's conception, design, and construction. Rather than being an undisputed site for collective memory as the Italian state envisioned, the mausoleo became, as Alessandro Portelli describes, quote, a contested space, a monument for the public cult of martyrs and heroes, and a graveyard for personal and family mourning, end quote. To correct this elision in the historical record, this paper will detail how the Fosse Ardeatine victims, mothers, and widows explicitly made demands and at times outright rejected the wishes of the Italian state as to how the massacre would be monumentally commemorated. This reconstruction will illustrate the all too often undervalued role of women as stewards of memory and their fundamental role in crafting a history of the Italian resistance out of what was then still a lived trauma. And by mutually considering the grassroots memorials these women had independently created at the massacre site, we are reminded of their self-determination and remembering those lost not only as martyrs, but more importantly as individuals. Prior to the construction of the mausoleo, the Fosse Ardeatine caves quickly became a massive pilgrimage site, with reports estimating approximately 7,000 visitors each Sunday. Carla Gabrielli, whose parents were close friends of several victims, references how once the massacre site was known, quote, I think the next day or a few days later, they formed a sort of procession of women. They went, this small band of women, again, there to see, end quote. These women wanted to witness the site and scene of such an immense crime and tragedy. Let us not forget that the Nazi soldiers attempted to detonate and conceal the execution site, the immense fissures from which were left intact by the monument's architects as a reminder of this cowardice. Viewing as such became an ethical act. For this reason, when Ally representatives in Rome initially wanted to build a monument on top of the bodies without exhuming them, Giulia Spizzichino, who lost 7 relatives from the Di Consiglio family at the Fosse Ardeatine, recounted how, quote, all the families rebelled. This way, we will never know whether our loved ones are under there or we must still wait for them, end quote. The newly widowed Rosetta Stame, married to opera singer, activist, and Fosse Ardeatine Nicola Stame, recounts the difficulty of finding material support for burying the dead, and describes her mother's actions to appeal for support. Quote, my mother was great. She climbed so many times the stairs of the Capitol, she even went to the Vatican for help, end quote. Vera Simoni, the daughter of Italian General Simone Simoni, lost in the massacre, in turn described how her mother, sister, and herself went to Ally Colonel John R. Pollock and demanded that the bodies be identified one by one. Quote, so he looked us in the eye and saw that we would not yield. And a few days later, he came over with his aide and said, we're going to do it, end quote. Through their persistence, these women succeeded in recruiting the help of anatomopathologist Attilo Ascarelli, here at the center, who over months of tireless work securely identified nearly all of the victims. Another demand made by the victims' families was to do with the Monument Commission's proposal to bury the victims elsewhere, with suggestions ranging from the nearby Christian catacomb complex of San Callisto or Rome's Verano Cemetery. A November 5th, 1946 issue of the Anfim periodical Gloria in turn describes how, quote, the families of the victims demonstrated their decisive opposition to the proposal of a cemetery arrangement outside of the Fosse Ardeatine, deemed offensive to the dead and living and in every way inadequate to the grandiosity of the sacrifice of the martyrs, end quote. It was only after a compromise was reached, whereby the victims would be buried in a collective, covered space adjacent to the caves, that the families finally signed their approval for the mausoleum design proposed by architects Giuseppe Perugini, Nello Aprile, Cino Calcaprina, Aldo Cardelli, Mario Fiorentini, and sculptors Mirko Basaldella and Francesco Coccia. This explicit attachment to the caves themselves can only be fully understood by evaluating the makeshift shrines created by victim families in the immediate months after the massacre. These shrines are fortunately visible today thanks to a panning shot from the 1945 partisan film about the resistance, Giorni di Gloria, as well as photographs from Luce Cinecittà's historical archive. Met first by an array of commemorative wreaths seen here on the right, visitors entering the caves would then be met with walls teeming with an array of photographs and personal effects placed by victim relatives. They were mainly composed of photographs of the victims and studio or military portraits, identification cards, and family photographs that were simply tacked to the cave walls. Nearly every photograph was accompanied by a written dedication and other memorabilia, such as religious icons, political party ribbons, and newspaper clippings. For approximately 3 years, these makeshift shrines were a defining characteristic of the early experience of the site. Several accounts collected by Portelli further document the experience of the shrines. For instance, Claudio Fanno, a son of one of the victims, recounts how, quote, all brought photographs, then they wrote the coffin's number on them. Back then, a photograph was still something rather special, end quote. The visual impact of these shrines powerfully reflects the sheer diversity of lives lost. Countless private memorials have here been relegated to a single collective space, but not at a sacrifice to the victims' individual identities. And particularly with the Fosse Ardeatine being actively framed as a national symbol, these memorials were a means for families to reassert their own agency in mourning their loved ones as individuals, rather than commemorating them as sacrificial martyrs. Whereas the state's official monument sought to reframe the tragic events as the sacrificial founding of the new republic, the spontaneous shrines were an ephemeral and deeply personal means of navigating a collective trauma and creating a unique space of communion between fellow mourners and those who had been lost. These grassroots memorials articulated aspects of a local, individual, and ideological memory of the Roman resistance that had become otherwise suppressed within the mausoleum's unified framework. And thinking back on them today can help us to remember the turbulent emotional and political context in which historical memory of the resistance was first constructed. Another concerted and early attempt to construct a historical memory of the Italian resistance is also the Giorni di Gloria film itself. Interestingly enough, within the film, both the images of female mourners at the massacre site paired with the moving shrines they created were instrumentalized to communicate the full weight of the loss caused by the massacre. The explicitly gendered dynamics of mourning illustrated within and perpetuated by the film are reflected in the women's traditional black dress, depictions of their continued and dutiful motherhood, scenes of turbulent mourning at the site of their loved ones' remains, and recurrent images of their downcast gazes. And yet Giorni di Gloria also illustrates how these women were able to simultaneously remain within the prescribed and acceptable limits of the societal role of the grieving woman, while also pushing past these boundaries and transgressing into outright politicized rage. For instance, these scenes of women mourning at the caves were directly preceded by a partly censored depiction of the popular lynching of the former director of Regina Coeli Prison, Donato Carretta. Carretta was chased out of court, according to several accounts by widows and relatives of the victims, before being beaten along the banks of the Tiber River and hung outside of the prison he once directed. By reproducing these turbulent events just prior to the painful grieving at the massacre site, the image of female mourners was explicitly linked to the capacity for collective grief to transform into political rage and summary justice. The political and personal are here fundamentally linked. Ultimately, just as the resistance was a people-led movement, so too was its historical commemoration. Through this mutual investigation of the official monument and grassroots memorials to the massacre, I hope to have illustrated the competing needs of institutional commemoration advocated by the state and familial mourning spearheaded by women. In their newfound role as stewards of memory, women were essential to the earliest constructions of a historical account of the Italian resistance. And ironically enough, traditionally gendered dynamics of grief and the societally accepted role of women in mourning is precisely what enabled these widows and mothers to exercise greater political agency in the realm of public commemoration. I would like to leave you today with an excerpt from a poem by Lia Albertelli, the wife of Fosse Ardeatine victim and founding member of the Partito d'Azione Pillo Albertelli. The poem is entitled La prima volta alle Fosse Ardeatine and captures far better than I ever could the magnitude of the loss these women experienced and the bravery of their advocacy for rightful burial and commemoration. She writes, "We hold on to one another, hand in hand, a few brides, and with us is a sister and a mother. At the end of a cave rises a tall heap. We climb, and the earth opens under our steps. From the broken clouds, a bursting wind assails us, its heavy breath harder and harder. One of us gathers a blood-clogged strand of hair. Her desperate scream hurls us to earth. We are there underground, and we tread with our feet upon the fathers of our children." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. I'd like to open the floor to questions or comments, if there are any. For Elizabeth? Aviva.
For Patricia, I have a question for Patricia, comment for Patricia.
Is Patricia still here?
Yep. Hi there.
Hello, Patricia. Yeah, thank you for your paper. It's very interesting. Might I ask you if you're actually writing about this portrait? I don't see it as a portrait, actually. Rather of a kind of image of a presence, and that what we're looking at is actually an image of a ghost. And it seems to me exactly what you've been saying.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it, actually. It is
The sense that the identity of the image and the personage of the image is kind of unstable already for your discussion, and obviously the depiction itself, which seems, while it's lingering and this lingering presence, it's also beyond time and beyond space. And the other thing that I was thinking of it is that, it's gone now. I can't remember what I was thinking. But yeah, it seems to me that that's what we're looking at is a presence beyond death. That would be what mourning is in any case, is this attachment to something beyond life itself.
Yes, indeed. That's really the way I'm looking at it at different levels. I mean, on the one hand, of course, I do also want some kind of remembrance for the person who has been erased, but at the same time, this portrait is not necessarily, of course, not necessarily a portrait of her, but because it has come to symbolize her, we continue to speak of it and we return to it as a way of also keeping her story alive And it just, never ceases to amaze me how long this goes on. There are still current theatrical productions and films and things being done about the subject of the subject that this painting is supposed to represent. And again, as I said, I cannot in any way confirm that this would be her, but in a way that's almost the beauty of it, is that it just continues to haunt us through time. That's maybe her comment. Somehow through this painting, she lives on, right?
Other questions?
Thank you. Also a question for Patricia, but maybe for also the others. Very art historical questions. I was wondering how many other paintings of a girl depicted like that? So from the shoulders, turning her head, watching the public with the open mouth. Do you know? If I think the only other one I know is Vermeer, the girl with the pearl herring. And something interesting, and maybe most of you know, there is one painting of Vermeer that is the Saint Praxedis that is in Tokyo. That is quite weird painting in the catalog of Vermeer because it's the copy of a painting of Felice Ficcherelli that is not a very famous painter. So scholars were wondering how it's possible that Vermeer, that never traveled to Italy, copied Felice Ficcherelli. And so I was wondering, could it be possible that the painting of, let's say, Beatrice was shared already in the beginning of the 17th centuries via copies, via engravings? So we could imagine that other people outside Italy have seen this kind of portraits of a girl watching behind her shoulders.
Yeah, I mean, certainly from my end, it's possible. We know that, I mean, the Vermeer has been mentioned as another potential example, although, of course, the painting by Vermeer doesn't have this type of pathos. It's more of what they call, in art history, they will call the Vermeer trony, which is a kind of type that is not a portrait. It's almost like a genre painting without the rest of the activity there. And those we begin to see at that time. But certainly the image of Beatrice, not Beatrice, spread outside of Italy. There were engravings by the 1700s in Germany and Austria, France. So I'm not sure how far back they go. I know of some in the early 1700s, so I don't know before then, but certainly by that time, and definitely outside of Italy. In terms of how common that position is, we know, for example, that Elisabetta Sirani, who was a colleague of Guido Reni, the Bolognese Baroque painter, she did a self-portrait of herself, a drawing where she has a similar pose where she's kind of looking back over her shoulder. And I can't say that it's a common motif, but there are a few other examples. But certainly this image spread far and wide through engravings and prints.
Thank you.
Juliet.
So I've got a question for Patricia and also for Lindsay. First, Patricia, just to continue this sort of tantalizing theme, which I think possibly was underpinning Jonathan's observation. How far is Beatrice's story and image entangled with a kind of voyeuristic construction of that memory? And I'm thinking, that Shelley's Cenci was revived and staged in the 1890s as one of the symbolist theatres for decadents and symbolists. But the overall interest in that was perhaps the themes, indeed, of violence and voyeurism, rather than the pathos of the individual story.
Not quite as familiar with the later 19th century versions. I know that it, according to most of the records, it didn't begin to be discussed as this as representative of this tragic story of Beatrice until about the 18th century. We don't have earlier records that state before then in the 1600s say that this is actually the painting of Beatrice. We sort of begin to find mentions of that in the 18th century when this, this connection begins, and then it just takes off because it was so irresistible to the romantic painters. I mean, I actually came to it as part of a larger project that had to do with the concept of I was titling it Death and the Maidens, because there seemed to be also another missing monument, in this case of a woman artist, that no one has tracked down yet or no one has cared to find. And so this idea of erasing women somehow is how the project started for me, like the ghosts of these women.
I think that would be really fascinating to develop that that entanglement with the death and the maiden iconography, because there's also a complexity there with the maiden being somehow implicated in her downfall in the death of the maiden iconography, which makes again that problem about the institutional and the family and the erasure a really complex nexus around that. Thanks, it was such a great paper.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for the questions.
Yes. I have a question for Lindsay, if I may. Lindsay, it was really fascinating to see these personal makeshift shrines at the mausoleum site. I mean, how far, was there any pushback against this kind of very personal and cumulative expression of grieving by the authorities?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because if I had more time today, I would have loved to go more into that aspect of things. So the part of my talk where I mentioned how there were different proposals to bury the victims elsewhere, there are a couple of interpretations of that. The state's reasoning for that was the sort of infrastructural instability of the caves, but there are also letters that reflect that actually there was a really deep concern about, as I said, 7,000 mourners every single Sunday. That is a lot of people to be visiting this site, and people that were deeply enraged by what had happened. And so there was a very strong concern, actually, that kind of continual gathering of people would then result in some sort of foment or protest, which it actually did on several occasions. So yeah, there were proposals to bury them elsewhere explicitly for those reasons. They didn't explicitly reference the shrines themselves. It was more so about those acts of pilgrimage and people in very volatile acts of mourning. There was a lot of concern surrounding that.
That's really interesting, thank you, because it came up in the First World War as well with soldiers. A.B. Warburg famously writes, I don't know if you know this text by him, about the superstition of having talismans, locks of hair, personal family photographs, families of spouses in the First World War combat zones, which he saw was a very kind of regressive kind of activity. It's very interesting coming from A.B. Warburg, because at that he was bound up with a kind of trying to reconcile his own theories of art with a kind of patriotic need for a patriotic narrative.
Yeah, and there's an interesting kind of reversal of this kind of role of relics in the case of the Fosse Ardeatine, because to identify the victims, a lot of times objects that were found on the bodies were used as a means to identify. So I think another really important aspect of the shrines is that whereas the family members couldn't control those objects, they could control what ephemera or materials they were using in the shrines to remember their loved ones. So.
Great, thank you. I have a question for Jonathan. I'm fascinated by the identification, perhaps, of which you didn't talk about, but I think was quite strong in the fact that Queen Louise, seems to be a new queen ancient Queen Artemisia, a personification of Artemisia, who builds a mausoleum
Yes.
in honor of her dead husband, Mausolus. Did Louise use Artemisia in her iconographic program of the mausoleum space in the chateau, or in other artwork?
Is a very good question indeed, because for the other side, Catherine de' Medici commended a tapestry that was never realized about the topic of Queen Artemisia, and later the tapestry has been realized by Maria de' Medici for the death of Henry IV. So indeed, it's something very interesting. For what I've seen till now, I never found something about Louise and Artemisia. Something interesting is that Louise had one main problem. Henry III was unburied till 1610. And the reason was that Henry III has been excommunicated by the Pope. So she spent all her life to ask the rehabilitation of her husband to the Pope, and finally she died 9 years before her husband was buried in Saint-Denis. So maybe we could imagine that if she could have her husband buried, she also could have something like the mausoleum. And because also, that is also interesting, the mausoleum of the Valois, it was a round chapel built by Catherine de' Medici close to Saint-Denis, was never finished. And after the Bourbons destroyed the mausoleum of the Valois, where actually Henry III has been put in 1630. So there is really this topic of she wanted to celebrate the memory of her husband, but she couldn't. Yeah, she needed to do in a private space that in a way was also visible, because people who visited her see that small mausoleum. Yeah. Welcome.
A comment. Well, all your papers. Thank you, Patricia. What time is it in New York now?
It's 10 to 5 a.m.
So, thank you for attending.
That's fine. It was great. Thank you. I had lots of coffee, so.
And so it's all very interesting papers. Mine is more a comment just to, I don't know, to reflection on Lindsay papers. And of course, while you are talking, my mind came to Roma Città Aperta by Rossellini. And that I was just browsing a little bit to refresh my memory. That was shot in 1944, just right after the massacre of Via Rasella event. And Roma Città Aperta was right away prized with everything. So for best actor in role, best actresses in role, best script, best everything, because it's really worth having all those prizes. And the Rossellini's vision was that of, even though I love him, but it was a very patriarchal setting of the whole movie, where Anna Magnani was playing the role of the woman who, in a way, kind of caused all the things that happened the way after. And so this review of what really happened on the gender perspective, it's interesting, even to better understand that period from 1944 to 1958. To remember that Legge Merlini was 1958, 1959, something like that. And yeah, it was just, a reflection. But yes, thank you for also touching, of course, paper.
I think it's time for coffee.
Definitely.
And thank you, all our three speakers, for the wonderful presentations this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Patricia. And we'll meet back at about 1:15
11:30.
earlier.
11:30.
Oh, 11:30. Yeah. Okay. 11:30.
You need the way to the coffee place. welcome back to the last section of the conference. This section topic is film, theater, and opera. To open the session will be Katrina Xuereb from Malta. Katrina has a Bachelor in Arts with in History, and she obtained it in 2015, and then a Master in Film Studies she obtained it 4 years ago. Her research centers on heritage films and period costumes. And she has served as art director for 3 short films produced by university students for 3 consecutive years, and in addition to working on other production shown on local and international television and in cinemas. Currently, Katrina holds the position of Executive Officer at the Superintendence of Cultural Heritage in Malta, and has worked as a cultural heritage planning consultant for the past 3 years. Katrina has participated in a number of conferences organized by the History of Art and Fine Arts Students Association, with the main focus on women and film. Katrina talks his Social Corsets, Motive of Confinement in Victorian Cinema. Welcome, Katrina.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. In the mid to late 19th century, women's fashion was predominantly defined by an hourglass silhouette, characterized by a small waist achieved to corsets. The corset was initially designed to support and shape the body while allowing for comfortable breathing. These undergarments were commonly worn by women of all ages and sizes, reaching the peak of their popularity during the Victorian era. In art and literature, corsets symbolize the feelings of confinement and oppression that many women experienced within the social and cultural context of Europe during this time. This paper examines the representation of female subjectivity and societal restrictions in modern film adaptations set in the Victorian era. By analyzing the use of corsets, particularly the motifs of tight lacing and birdcage imagery, the study aims to highlight how these elements reflect and critique the oppression faced by women in Victorian society. Tight lacing is progressively lacing a corset tighter to enhance appearance and posture or to experience a sense of bodily restriction. This trend originated in Victorian Europe and sparked essential discussions about fashion and health by dress reformers and medical professionals. Helen Roberts argues that tight corsetry is crucial in enforcing social control over women in Victorian society because of its restrictive nature. She suggests that corsets and tight lacing compel women to conform to standards set by men, presenting them as fragile and passive. Roberts links the societal pressures of oppressions faced by women to the restrictive nature of tight lacing. The imagery of a Victorian woman laced into her corset by a maid or family member illustrates an intriguing aspect of historical fashion and social norms in film. The scene often captures the physical and cultural constraints of the time. Expressions of discomfort frequently mark such scenes as women's bodies adjust to the constraints of this undergarment. For instance, in Gone with the Wind, Scarlett O'Hara is depicted gripping her bedpost tightly during the fitting whilst discussing a potential marriage with her maid. Antonia Primorac discusses the persistence of contemporary popular media in depicting the Victorian female silhouette as a tightly corseted hourglass figure, often portrayed as repressed and distressed. In the animated film The Corpse Bride, set in Victorian England, Tim Burton employs the motif of tight lacing to symbolize Victoria Everglott's entrapment in a marriage arranged by her parents. A notable example occurs in an early scene where she is tightly laced into a corset by her maid. The character's continuous wearing of restrictive clothing throughout the film serves as a powerful symbol of her repressions and the limitations imposed by her parents. Thus, this visual element effectively highlights her struggles for freedom and self-expression. The scene is echoed in the pilot episode of The Alienist. A maid helps Sarah Howard unlace her corset after a rough workday. As the first female secretary at the New York City Police Department, Sarah faces mockery and intimidation from the men around her. A close-up reveals scars on Sarah's back from her tight corset. Traditionally, wearing a chemise under a corset protects the corset from sweat while also safeguarding the body against potential scars. In this scenario, the scars represent the pain and the limitations experienced by women like her, illustrating the pressures women face when confronting societal expectations. As the maid loosens the corset, Sarah finds it difficult to catch her breath, emphasizing the impact of tight lacing. The motif of tight lacing often generates discussions among feminists who view it as a symbol of patriarchy and oppression. However, the perception that all women practice this trend has been debunked for decades. For example, the gowns designed in Gone with the Wind portray an unrealistic 18-inch waist for Scarlett, as noted by fashion historian Valerie Steele. Steele's research is based on authentic sources, including records and catalogs from Victorian corset makers, and original gowns and corsets housed in museums like the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. She emphasizes that the importance of recognizing the distinction between the ordinary corset worn by women in the Victorian era and the rare practice of tight lacing. While women did wear Victorian corsets, they typically did not aim for the extreme goal of achieving 18-inch waists. In contemporary films, the portrayal of Victorians often likens women to caged birds, effectively highlighting the restrictive gender roles women face. This imagery has its roots in the 18th century, reflecting the bourgeoisie's fascination with exotic birds. This motif continued to evolve as women were frequently depicted as small caged birds in the Western literature and art. Pre-Raphaelite art, in particular, captures this symbol, using the imagery of delicate exotic birds to reflect the constraints experienced by elite women, as elaborated by Elaine Schiffer, who has researched the subject extensively. Historians highlight that the metaphor of women as caged birds effectively reflects Victorian gender roles and societal restrictions, while also showcasing the diverse ways women have persisted patriarchy. Early feminists, such as Mary Wollstonecraft, utilized the birdcage metaphor to constructively critique society, framing it as a representation of entrapment and encouraging the dialogue about the need for change. In A Vindication of the Rights of Women, Wollstonecraft examines how society views women as roaming around their guilt cage, only seeking to adorn their prison. This metaphor plays a significant role in Victorian cinema, as the mise-en-scène and costumes effectively illustrate the societal perceptions of women's confinement and oppression during this era. This analysis aims to delve into the representation of women as caged birds in Victorian cinema, with a primary focus on Jane Campion's The Portrait of a Lady, with some example from Tom Hooper's Les Miserables for a deeper understanding of the cinematic portrayal of Victorian women. An early poster for Jane Campion's adaptation of The Portrait of a Lady showcases a striking ghostly white gown, accompanied by a man's hand reaching the protagonist's corseted waist. This imagery powerfully suggests the husband's control and influence over Isabel's body and life. The film highlights Isabel Archer's social development and how it influences her appearance through costume changes. Before marriage, Isabel wore a simple corseted gowns representing her youth and innocence. As a married woman, her increasingly corseted, dark, and elaborate gowns constrained her waist, symbolizing her loss of individuality and growing confinement. The birdcage imagery is enhanced as the tightly corseted Isabel is portrayed as a caged bird in striking shot, highlighting her sense of entrapment. For example, the scene where Isabel returns to her marital home dressed in a peacock blue, tightly corseted silhouette adds to the impression of her entering a prison-like cage, whereby she is the peacock and her marital home is the cage. This is further emphasized by a slow-motion shot of the doors closing behind her, symbolically enveloping her in the drab surroundings. The long train of Isabel's dress, resembling a peacock's tail, crawls behind her, symbolizing her struggle and her pressure to conform to her husband's expectations. In a symbolic scene, her husband steps on her gown train to entrap her and accuse her of coming between his daughter and a wealthy suitor. This idea sharply contrasts with Cosette's situation in Les Miserables. For Cosette, love is a form of escapism. According to Anna Stevenson, Cosette perceives her adoptive father's home as entrapment. Cosette's subjectivity as a character is conveyed to the audience through birdcage imagery, as the mise-en-scène and her typical Victorian attire. Building on Robert's analysis of Victorian clothing, one can see how Cosette, a privileged Victorian woman, embodies the constraints of her time. Clad in a corset and crinoline, she is effectively transformed into a caged bird surrounded by hoops and steel, illustrating the limitations placed on women through fashion and in the Victorian period. Like Campion's character Isabel, Cosette's femininity and elite background contribute to her dependence on and confinement, much like a bird in a cage. In her adaptation of the Portrait of a Lady, Campion reimagines Isabel as a woman who, while initially passive and confined by societal expectations for matrimony, seeks to foster her individuality by escaping marital control. By choosing to leave her marriage, Isabel would shed her restrictive clothing, symbolically liberating her from the constraints of her marriage. Although Isabel has the opportunity to make her own choices, the tight corset around her waist symbolizes the ongoing constraints placed on her as a woman. This imagery reflects that as a woman, she may still be confined regardless of her choices. In this final scene, Isabel, embodying a bird-like figure, returns to her marital home, her cage. She fulfills her responsibilities and honors her promise to her stepdaughter, highlighting the complex interplay between personal desires and societal obligations placed on women. The portrayal of corseted woman's hourglass silhouette is a typical representation of the Victorian female. This image is often linked to the concept of a confined woman. Interestingly, while historical evidence presented by Steele challenges this stereotype, many filmmakers use the Victorian corset as a motif to explore the theme of women's restrictions in the past. Nevertheless, certain films based in the Victorian era challenge the conventional use of corsetry. For example, Greta Gerwig's portrayal of Jo March in Little Women features her wearing a menswear-inspired wardrobe, including vests, neck scarves, and red and indigo blazers, reflecting the character's fire and passion. Jo's costumes contrast sharply with her sister, Meg, who embodies the traditional Victorian woman. This is evident in Meg's clothing, marked by her corset and crinoline, and her role as a domesticated woman of that era. In contrast, Jo, without a corset, is seen as an empowered figure with a strong will and determination that ultimately leads her to become a successful writer and marry someone she deeply loves. In conclusion, this paper highlights that Victorian cinema often depicts women as constrained in pursuing independent self-definition within a patriarchal society. Filmmakers frequently use costumes to convey the experience of oppression faced by women. Thus, the motifs of tight lacing and birdcage imagery served as significant metaphors, effectively highlighting the constraints, oppression, and domestication that characterize women's lives in the Victorian era. By recognizing these representations, the audience gains insight into the historical context of women's experiences, contributing to a broader understanding of costume and gender dynamics in film. And this is also a list of bibliography and filmography. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina. Next and last, we will be speaking from remotely.
Hey. Here, do you hear me?
Yeah, good morning, Irene.
Hello everybody.
Irene Valle-Corpas is a postdoctoral researcher in film studies at the University of Valencia and previously at the University of Granada. She has been visiting researchers at the École des Hautes and Sciences Sociales at the École Nationale des Beaux-Arts in Paris and Bordeaux. She also completed a one-year postdoctoral stay at UNAM in Mexico, and she has published numerous articles and book chapters on film, social movements, and contemporary art, as well as curated exhibitions and public activities for various centers. She is the author of the book Un poco de política, Jean-Luc Godard, La ciudad y la subjetividad contemporánea, and the editor of the book Reversos del Amor, Conflictos Afectivos en la Cultura Contemporánea. Irene Valle presents a talk, Something Completely Mad and Extraordinary, Love and Artistic Creation in Charlotte Salomon's Life or Theater. Welcome, Irene.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your presence, and I want to thank especially the organizers for their effort in making possible this Congress. I'm going to talk in my name and in Sonia Rivas' name also. We are both very sorry not to be there. We just couldn't. I'm pregnant and I cannot travel as much as I wish, but I'm going to do my best. Well, our presentation is about Charlotte Salomon. You may know her. She was a German artist of Jewish origin who was deported and murdered in Auschwitz at the age of 26. Her life was shaped by love, music, and painting, but also by a family history of suffering and suicide, all of her life is narrated in her monumental work, Life or Theater with Interrogations. Our presentation proposes a reading of this work that highlights the fact that life or theater stems in essence from a decision in a moment of deep crisis while in exile in the south of France, not to fall into complete despair and commit suicide. I mean, what we think is that the act of creation of this work and the remembrance of a past love provide Charlotte with the necessary stability to carry on living under harrowing circumstances. The work is made by 784 gouache that, as I said, narrate her whole life. The work was produced between 1941 and 1942 when Charlotte was living in hiding in a hotel in the Côte d'Azur in the south of France. Many of the illustrations feature a transparency with a text in overlay and are annotated with the title of a piece of music. So what we have is, are images with figures, but they have also reference to specific songs as specific classical music. So it is a kind of intermediate work. The work could be related with theater, with cinema, with comic, and with music, with performing arts. The character in this play are her relatives and close friends, her grandparents, her father, her mother, and so on. Two characters stand out. Her stepmother, Paulinka Lindbergh, who in the work has the name of Paulinka Bimbam. Charlotte changes a little bit the names from her real life to the work. And another character who is constantly present in the images, who is this man, Amadeus d'Aberlon, who in real life was Alfred. He was her stepmother's singing teacher, and Charlotte and Alfred had love history, which is narrated in the main part of the work. The prelude tells Charlotte's life from her birth, childhood, and youth. The main part is devoted to depict Salomon's passion for Alfred, and the final part narrates her life in France. Salomon arrived in France in December 1938, fleeing Berlin to escape the barbarity of Nazism together with her maternal grandparents. In France, her grandfather reveals to Salomon the dreadful secret of her family. Her mother, her aunt, and a total of 7 members of her family committed suicide in the past. almost all of them were women. In that moment, when she knew this terrible secret, she says that, and I quote, "She feels the whole world has to be put together again," end quote. Afterwards, Salomon and her grandfather were deported in a Nazi camp in the Pyrenees. They were released because of the old age of the grandfather, and they both returned to the Côte d'Azur. But in the way back to Nice, Salomon's grandfather asked her to share the bed with him. Salomon feels that she is on the verge of going mad and that the world is breaking down. In a letter, not in the work, but in a letter, she confesses to having killed her grandfather by putting a berenal in his omelette. Finally, in October 1943, Salomon was moved first to Drancy, then to Auschwitz, and she was sent to the gas chamber. So that's, in general terms, her life. In those years of terror, Salomon writes in one of the images that, and I quote, she found herself confronted with the question of whether to commit suicide or to undertake something completely mad and extraordinary, end quote. She chose the latter, and for nearly 2 years, she painted nonstop all day long, and she created this monumental work, Life or Theater. The first biography of the artist appeared in 1994 by Mary Lowenthal Felstiner. It was then followed by countless publications from different perspectives by authors such as Van Alphen, Smetterlin, Carr, Julie Watson, or Griselda Poller, who wrote several papers and a very big book on Charlotte. Academic literature has linked Salomon's wash to several major names in the European intelligentsia of the first half of the century, from Walter Benjamin's reflection on the tragic nature of history to the distancing effect theorized by Bertolt Brecht, or, for example, Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytical method. On a visual level, Salomon, we can establish parallels with the work of the European avant-garde, like Vincent van Gogh, Edvard Munch, Der Blaue Reiter, Dadaism, or the so-called Entartete Kunst. Here you have images of Haeckel, Otto Dix, Kate Kollwitz, or the Entartete Kunst, Munch, or Van Gogh. We also could include reference to the present music, from cabaret to classical, or we can say that her work is very cinema played a fundamental role in her work. She integrates montage, ellipses, temporal discontinuity, flashback, zoom, etc. Here you have several, or comic. Here you can see it. Montage, flashback, etc. In addition to these influences and connections, we must add another element no less symptomatic of Salomon's modern gaze: the representation of the city. In her images, the city is very modern, agitated, and tumultuous. Popular masses spread out in vast leisure halls, theaters, cinema, parks, and they also make demonstrations against or for the Nazi regime. In the same vein, she creates remarkable representation of the body, both female and male. The body appears fragmented into pieces, strongly disproportionate, seen from different perspectives, and marked by female sexual desire, which I think is very important. In general, the analysis of Salomon by scientific literature like Pollock or other, tend to recognize that it is a work made at a time of crisis, but they emphasize that Solomon was trying to denounce her situation. So they tend to say that it is a work of critique, that what she wanted is to criticize the interwar period from a political and also personal perspective. Our theory is that all of it is true. It is, of course, true that this is a work of denunciation and a work of critique. But the main thing in life or theater is a celebration of love, a remembrance of love as a way of sustaining life in terrible circumstances. In fact, what we see in the central part of the work is a portrait of her relationship with Alfred. Sorry, a relationship that took place several years earlier, and remembers all the moments, the difficult moments, the beautiful moments, and we think that with this story she produces a fiction that allows her to live and stay alive in those moments. It is the memory of an experience of love that maintains her alive. In line with Jacques Lacan, we could venture that love seems here to have the function of something that ties together through registers at risk of separating. The imaginary of the painting, the symbolic of the words transported up to text and music, and the real that lurks under the form of total death and despair. There are thousands of paintings where we see Charlotte and Amadeus in an embrace, seated on a park bench, talking or making love. The two figures, barely sketched, are made of vivid colors: red, orange, dark green, yellow, and above all, a powerful electric blue that craft bold images. This reinforces the feeling of joie de vivre marked by the erotic desire that this sequence conveys. In other words, Salomon's denudes the entire background to intensify the presence of colors and bodies. So, in conclusion, we think that besides denouncing the terrible situation of the interwar period, beside that critique, her artistic creation is a reaffirmation of life through love. The woman's point of view, the meaning of the importance of women's sexual desire in the work, and the modernity of the images make this a masterpiece of European avant-garde. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Irene, and thanks for attending. And best wishes for your pregnancy.
Thank you.
Well, we can open floor to the questions. Jonathan.
Where is Katrina? Oh, sorry. So it's a question for you, but maybe more general, and it's a bit provocative, so forgive me. I was thinking indeed about the scene of Gone with the Winds, and at a certain point, Scarlett, she's saying, "Oh, please, mommy, pull it tighter. I need a 17-inch waist." And you explained very well how we use the image of the corset, of the crinoline, as a metaphor for women's condition in that century. And the provocative question is, how much this vision we have is correct? And I explain why I'm asking that. It's quite interesting that if we watch to sources, and I want to underline how we read the sources thinking about Chiara. If we see critics about the main critics about the corsets in the Victorian age, they came from men. They came from doctors. They are telling you don't have to wait to wear corsets because it's dangerous for your health. And if we go very far in the time, the first critic to the ancestor of corsets was by religious men. I'm thinking about the famous painting of Fouquet with the Virgin, with Agnès Sorel showing her breasts, because the corset is, of course, giving her tight waist, but is exposing the breasts. And the provocative question is, if we do comparisons with other cultures, I'm thinking about China. As you know, in China, for a long period, we have the bounded feet. Something interesting, again, if you watch to the sources, according to the sources, women wanted to have bounded feet. We see in the middle of the 17th century, there is the end of the Ming dynasty and the beginning of the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty was a Manchu dynasty, so it was a foreigner dynasty. And ladies from Manchu aristocracy asked a permission to the emperor to have bounded feet. The emperor refused. Only women from Han origin, so real Chinese women, were allowed to have bounded feet. So aristocracy from the new dynasty cannot have bounded feet, according to the sources. And last provocation, we have talking about the girl in Tehran. Often when we read about the discussion around the hijab, we have some people defending the fact that women should be free to wear the hijab. And if we try to listen to voices of Muslim women, some women are saying, I want to wear it. And the question is, of course, how much also they are into a culture that, of course, made them accepting the fact that they want to wear the hijab. So going back to corsets, what we know, if you know it, if we have women voices from the Victorian periods talking against the corsets, and so if the vision we have from movies of corset as constriction should be read with a sort of nuance.
If I may add just something, no, when Coco Chanel decided that women had to be freed by the corsets, not all women were standing by Coco Chanel. That was just an elite of women, intellectual women, who decided to follow up her new style. But most of the aristocratic or, I don't know, conservative, I don't know how we're going to call them, they were standing by the corsetry and they really liked to dress up that way. So this is a very interesting debate you opened. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you for the question. It's a very interesting question. Obviously, there's a difference between corsetry and tight lacing. So most women would wear the corset as an undergarment, just like most women actually wear the bra today. But there was also this trend of tight lacing. So they would want to look maybe thinner, more attractive. They would want to show that they have never been pregnant, therefore never been married, so they're single, they're available. Obviously, not all women wanted to do it. They might have been forced by parents or by society itself. But I think it was also a trend, just like there's the trend for wearing stiletto. Valerie Steele actually comments about this. Everyone wears shoes, right? But not everyone is wearing the stiletto. It's just a trend. It's painful if you're not wearing the right size, if you're uncomfortable. So that's her comment, which I would love to have elaborated on, but obviously time did not permit. No, not all women would tightly laced their corset, obviously, but the majority of them did. And there were comments about women from women as dress reformers, but also from doctors. You see images of like diagrams of women with all their organs going around their body. That's a very interesting topic to research about as well. I would love to research more about it. And then I'm moving on to the film part. No, obviously, I don't think such scenes were true to a certain extent. There might have been some instances, but I think filmmakers just love to exaggerate and show us like this restriction, sort of to emphasize what the women are feeling. In film, we say show, don't tell. So they're showing us rather than telling us. I think that's very interesting. But I would love to research more about tight lacing in reality. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Well, just to conclude, because it's a matter of fact that, you know, intellectuals wanted to dress differently. If we think of Rosa Bonheur, the French painter, that she decided to wear trousers, and there was a law in France just been recently cancelled that prohibited the women to wear trousers. And so you were just showing us Jo March. So for sure we have the voice of Mary Alcott, who was saying that, you know, Jo March didn't want to wear that way, but mostly not wearing something different. So I think that's just a path of research. It's an interesting path of research.
Yes, I wanted to pick up on Jonathan's point as well, regarding the material turn in fashion history that's taken place the last few years, in which they're making the garments, they're making the corsets, and they're finding they're not as restrictive as we have been led to believe. And they're finding sources also, women's voices that come and talk about these strictures as well as structures and strictures.
Yes, I think we've got to be, it's a really fascinating debate you've opened, but it also shows we've got to be careful not to sort of conflate sort of rather different contexts and applications. There's no doubt about it that this hourglass shape, if we see it endlessly reproduced in fashion plates, you know, particularly in 19th century Victorian England and in France as well, up to l'époque, we have to ask the question that women who be seen in society, who want to have status and image, and the importance of the creation of the image, the fashion image, there is a construct, you know, a beauty type, a body type, and that body type is inevitably produced in this case by the very restrictive garment. I mean, whether the actual garments really were 17-inch waist or not. And the second issue we have to consider that is the male medical voice, the concern that this would have in relation to pregnancy and motherhood. I think there is a question as to actually about bodily well-being, you know, on the part of the female. So we do have to take those into account, and the fact that this is consistent with that marked binary between women being constructed as being the angel in the home, the famous expression of Coventry Patmore, or on display on social. If you look at Katie Colvitt's own self-portraits around 1904, she's just wearing a simple chemise. She's not even dressed as a fashionable woman. So the argument with the status of the image of the fashionable woman is a powerful, you know, mode of representing for artists to push back against, you know, in the later part of the century. It is not surprising that this open chemise and the open bodice was a way of suggesting, I am not going to be restricted in this image construction, you know, also of fashionability or domesticity. So I think we can't underestimate the significance that has as well. Yeah.
That's a very interesting comment as well. I think if a woman were to wear the right size, it wouldn't be as restricting. It's still obviously not as comfortable as not wearing one. I've worn corsets before just to see what they're feeling. And I had my mom help me out. But in reality, you would also have to consider that you only, you lace it once. You open it from the front. You have these, it's like an early version of a button. So obviously, if you're uncomfortable, someone would have to help you to unlace it a bit. Yes, but your comment is very interesting. I think this comes also from film and literature. As I said, the fact that the corset has always been used as a metaphor. But is it really a metaphor? Was it restrictive? We'll never know. You know, we don't live in the 19th century. We wouldn't know what they're feeling, but I wouldn't want to walk around wearing a corset all day, that's for sure.
But if you look at, you know, in fashion museums, and if you look at the actual corsets and the particular fashion,
they're small, right?
I mean, they're tiny,
so small.
tiny. Even on one lacing, that would be a very, very, even on a small boned figure. Just imagine, you know, childbearing, or you know, this pregnancy experienced wearing corsets.
I believe they would have special corsets for maternity,
Yes.
but obviously, is it comfortable? I
Yes.
don't know. I don't think it's comfortable.
And what about having ribs removed? Because that was
There
a practice,
were some
wasn't
instances,
it? Yes.
yes, but they still do it today. Some people are doing it with cosmetic surgery. So not everyone is doing it, but there are a number of celebrities doing it.
Yes, but we know the medical risks now. I mean, we do have 21st century
it's
medicine.
very risky.
So,
I wouldn't do it.
yeah.
For sure. But they're still doing it.
Yeah.
And that's another interesting aspect to study.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the corset, how restrictive it is, and yet we're going back to it. We're using it as a fashion item. We're removing ribs again. Has it ever stopped? I highly doubt it. So, and we're still not everyone is wearing it, yes, but it's very interesting to look at it in this way. Thank you for your comments.
Thank you. No more questions? No? So Ade, if you want to come up here, we just can go forth the conclusion.
Finisco io. Well, I would like to thank everyone who has participated in every way to this wonderful conference the last 3 days, and in organising the conference beforehand, for your presence, for your contribution in the papers and the questions and discussions that we've had. I think it's been very, very fruitful 3 days, giving us new ways of thinking and looking at women's relationships in particular with other women, with their families, with their art, their art production. I would again like to thank the University of Arkansas, Consuelo, of course, and Fabio, and everyone who has participated. And we can go have something to eat. And we'll see you next year, we hope, in the same venue.
Yes, October, mid of October.
And here?
And here. Yeah. No, yes.
We hope it's here.
Yeah, we should be still here next year. And then we will be moving our venue, our seat actually, somewhere else. But yet, probably the next year we will be still here. And so, yes, it would be in mid of October as usual. And thank you all for being here, for your warmth, acceptance of our call, and for most of you, for your commitment to these events. And hope to see you next year, or yes, which will be celebrating the 50 years. And so we are thinking of something special to do. And yes, I do thank you, my university, the institution I'm working for, I serve, and my two dedicated students over there. They came here also today. You know, the American University is working load is from Monday to Thursday, so Friday should be a day off. Thank you for coming also today. Thank you for incredible job you have done. Fabio, without you, this conference wouldn't be the same. Thank you so much. See you next year. Thank you. And thank you to Adelina. I did forget.